Daniel had always prided himself on having a great sense of direction, so when his GPS app malfunctioned and failed to provide a route home, he wasn't worried. He had been driving through the city long enough to know a shortcut or two. This time, however, he took a turn into a neighborhood he'd never noticed before. Its entrance was marked by a rusted sign that was too weathered to read, but it felt like a quicker way out of the late-night traffic jam. The street was quiet, too quiet, with rows of houses that looked like they hadn't been touched by human hands in years. They stood dark and lifeless, their windows like empty sockets in skulls. The lawns were overgrown, fences leaning awkwardly into the sidewalks. Despite this, Daniel pressed on, assuming the eerie neighborhood would quickly lead him back to a main road. But the street didn't end. It seemed to stretch on endlessly, the same houses repeating themselves in a surreal loop. At first, Daniel thought he must have missed a turn. He made a U-turn to backtrack, but instead of finding his way out, he found himself passing the same abandoned houses he'd seen moments earlier. He began to notice things he had missed the first time: an old tricycle rusting on a porch, a flickering street lamp, a curtain fluttering in a window even though there was no breeze. The clock on his dashboard read 2:47 a.m., but no matter how long he drove, the time didn't change. He checked his phone again. No signal. His heart began to race as he realized he hadn't passed another car, another person, or even a stray animal. He hadn't even heard the faint hum of distant traffic. He was utterly alone. Determined to escape, Daniel stopped his car and got out to examine his surroundings. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. He called out, hoping for some sign of life, but his voice seemed to die in the air, swallowed by the stillness. As he turned back to his car, he noticed something chilling. One of the houses seemed closer than it had been moments before. Its front door was ajar, revealing a dark interior that seemed to beckon him. He hurried back into the car, his unease growing into full-blown panic. But as he started driving again, the street grew more surreal. The houses became more decayed, their walls marked with strange symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. Shadows danced in his peripheral vision, flitting between the houses, and each time he glanced in his rearview mirror, he thought he saw movement behind him. Then he heard it, a faint whispering, like voices carried on a non-existent wind. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and he could almost make out words. His name. They were calling his name. When he looked in the rearview mirror again, his blood ran cold. Shadows, vaguely human-shaped, but impossibly twisted, were following his car. Some moved fluidly along the ground, while others clung to the walls of the houses. One shadow climbed onto the road and stood directly in his path. Its featureless face turned toward him, and it lifted an arm to point ahead. Terrified, Daniel slammed on the accelerator and barreled past it. His headlights illuminated a new stretch of road, one that seemed even darker and more foreboding than before. The houses were now barely recognizable as homes, their structures warped, their windows shattered. The symbols on their walls were brighter, pulsating with an unnatural energy. He kept driving until his gas tank was nearly empty. Then, in the distance, he saw a faint light. Another house. But this one was pristine, its windows glowing warmly, its front porch decorated with a swing. It looked entirely out of place in the nightmare he was trapped in. Desperate for help, he stopped the car and stumbled toward the house. Inside, the air was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the cold dread outside. The living room was filled with photographs, all in ornate frames. But as he looked closer, his stomach dropped. The photographs depicted people, terrified people, standing on the very street he had been driving on. Some were screaming, others crying, and all of them were surrounded by the same shadows that had been following him. And then he saw it, his own face, frozen in a moment of pure terror, staring back at him from the most recent photo. The whispers began again, louder this time, coming from every corner of the house. The lights flickered, and the air grew cold. Daniel turned to flee, but the shadows were already there, blocking every exit. The next morning, the street was quiet once more, its houses abandoned, its road unmarked on any map. Somewhere in the darkness, Daniel's photo joined the others, his face a silent warning to anyone who dared venture onto the Vanishing Street. It was the kind of excitement that a small town rarely experienced, a traveling puppet show setting up in the central square. Brightly colored posters appeared overnight, plastered on every surface. They announced, "The Marvelous Marionettes, a show you'll never forget." By morning, a large ornate tent stood where the farmers' market usually took place. Its deep red fabric shimmered in the sunlight, and golden embroidery swirled in intricate patterns along the edges. The people of the town, starved for entertainment, gathered eagerly. The puppet master, a wiry man with a wide-brimmed hat and a silver-tipped cane, greeted the crowd with a flourish. His smile was too perfect, his eyes too bright. He spoke in a voice that carried like silk through the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to a spectacle beyond your wildest dreams, a show where puppets come to life and magic fills the air." The performance began, and it was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. The puppets moved with astonishing grace, their wooden limbs flowing as if they had joints of flesh and bone. They danced, laughed, and even cried, their expressions so vivid it was almost unsettling. Children sat transfixed, their eyes wide with wonder, while adults whispered uneasily among themselves. The puppets seemed too alive, every movement too fluid, every voice too real. The finale drew gasps as a marionette of a young girl spun in an elegant pirouette, her face frozen in an expression of pure joy. When the applause thundered through the tent, the puppet master bowed deeply. "Thank you, dear friends. You've been a delightful audience. We'll be here all week. Don't miss your chance to experience the magic again." But that night, something strange happened. Little Tommy Wilkes didn't come home. His mother called the neighbors, frantic, but no one had seen him since the show. The sheriff searched the woods and the fields, but found no trace of the boy. The next evening, despite the unease spreading through the town, the puppet show continued. This time, the marionette at the center of the performance bore an unsettling resemblance to Tommy. His sandy brown hair, his round cheeks, even the small birthmark on his hand. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some claimed it was just coincidence, others said it was a tribute, but a few began to suspect something far darker. The disappearances continued. Each night, another child went missing, and each night, the puppet show featured a new star puppet, a marionette that looked hauntingly like the missing child. One evening, after her own daughter vanished, Mrs. Caldwell stormed into the tent before the show began. She demanded answers, her voice shaking with rage and terror. The puppet master, unperturbed, simply smiled. "Madam, I assure you, all we do here is bring joy to the world. Would you like to see behind the curtain?" He gestured toward the back of the tent, where thick velvet drapes hung. Desperate, Mrs. Caldwell followed him. A few others from the town, emboldened by her bravery, joined her. What they found behind the curtain would haunt them forever. Rows of children stood motionless, their faces blank and lifeless. Strings were attached to their arms, legs, and heads, leading up to a vast network of wooden beams. Their eyes, once bright with life, were dull and glassy. Their mouths hung open slightly, as if frozen mid-scream. Mrs. Caldwell gasped as she recognized her daughter among them, her small body now nothing more than a puppet. The puppet master's voice was soft but menacing. "They're part of the magic now. Their innocence fuels the show, keeps it alive. Would you deny the world this beauty?" Screams erupted as the townsfolk tried to flee, but the strings came to life, snaking through the air like serpents. They wrapped around ankles and wrists, dragging the intruders toward the stage. The next night, the puppet show had a new finale, a group of lifelike marionettes that bore an uncanny resemblance to the adults who had gone missing the night before. When the week ended, the tent vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. The town was left hollow and quiet, its streets empty, its laughter gone. No one dared speak of the puppet show, but late at night some claimed to hear faint music drifting on the wind, a haunting melody that sent chills through the spine. Some say the marvelous marionettes still travel from town to town, putting on their unforgettable show. And with every performance, their collection grows. Would you like a ticket? Emily was a graduate student working late nights in the university library, chasing the threads of obscure knowledge for her thesis on ancient texts. The library, a massive Gothic structure, had always seemed a little too large for its catalogued books. Its labyrinthine halls held rumors among students of hidden passages, forgotten wings, and the occasional flickering shadow out of the corner of your eye. One rainy evening, Emily was buried in a stack of reference books on the 4th floor when a draft caught her attention. She turned to see a door ajar that she could have sworn had been locked earlier. Curiosity pulled her from her chair and she peeked through. It revealed a narrow staircase spiraling down into the darkness. "Must be maintenance," she murmured, though her heart thudded in her chest. She hesitated, but then, compelled by a strange pull, began to descend. The staircase seemed endless, carved from cold stone that grew damper with every step. At the bottom, she found herself in a vast, dimly lit floor. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and mildew. Rows upon rows of bookshelves stretched into the shadows, and an ancient chandelier hung above, its candles burning low. There were no signs or labels, but the books themselves were peculiar. Thick, leather-bound tomes with no titles on their spines. Emily pulled one out, curious. The book was filled with names, dates, and times, all handwritten in an elegant yet hurried script. She flipped to a random page. Margaret Ellison, 1923, October 12, 7:45. P.M. Timothy Franks, 1984, April 6, 11:32 a.m. The pattern chilled her. The dates seemed to correspond with death certificates she had seen during her research. The next book was the same, and the next. Her breath quickened as a terrifying realization formed in her mind. These books recorded the exact moments of people's deaths. She dropped the book she was holding and it fell open on the floor, flipping to a random page. Her eyes locked onto a single entry that froze her blood. Emily Foster, 2024, November 22nd, 11:34 p.m. She checked her watch. It was 11:30 p.m. Panic flooded her system as she turned and sprinted back toward the staircase. But the rows of bookshelves stretched on endlessly, and no matter how many turns she took, the staircase remained elusive. The air grew heavier, as if the room itself was alive, breathing in her fear. From the shadows came a soft rustling, like the sound of pages being turned. It grew louder, surrounding her, as if unseen hands were flipping through the tomes. She turned a corner and froze. A figure stood in the gloom, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a veil of shadows. It held an open book, its bony fingers tracing a line of text. When it looked up, its eyes glowed faintly, and a skeletal smile spread across its face. "The record must be complete," it rasped, its voice dry as crumbling parchment. Emily bolted, clutching her chest as her heartbeat roared in her ears. Her watch beeped, 11:33 p.m. She tripped and fell into a heap of books, scattering them across the floor. Desperate, she grabbed one and hurled it at the figure. The impact made it pause. Its gaze fell to the book, then back to her. Her eyes darted to the book in its hands. It was her book. "Please," she begged, "don't let this happen." The figure tilted its head, as if considering her plea. Slowly, it held out her book, its skeletal hand extending toward her. She hesitated, but took it. As soon as her fingers touched the leather, she felt a surge of knowledge rush through her. Faces, names, dates, times. She realized the books not only recorded deaths, but determined them. "You may alter your fate," the figure hissed, "but the cost is another's." She looked at the book. the ink trembling beneath her gaze. Her name blurred, and the blank space beneath it beckoned. She understood what it wanted. Tears streaming down her face, she scrawled a name, a friend, a rival, anyone, into the space. The second she lifted the pen, the figure vanished, and the staircase reappeared before her. She climbed back into the library above, her hands trembling and her heart heavy with guilt. Emily survived, but she could never look at her surviving friends or colleagues without a pang of dread. The library, now a place of forbidden knowledge, loomed in her mind. And deep below, in the silent floor of endless bookshelves, the pages of another name were being written.